Joining me today is Stacy Waldman Bass, author of Lightkeeper, a memoir through the lens of love and loss. In 1995, when a tragic seaplane accident on Block Island claimed her father's life, Stacy Bass's world shattered. She began to write as a way to process her excruciating grief while gathering the pieces of his life through collected photographs. Some 25 years later, her mother was diagnosed with and ultimately did die from pancreatic cancer. During her mother's illness, she created a living tribute of images and words that built a community of support around her mother when she needed it most. By collecting and sharing photographs of her parents, she recognized how photographs serves not only as records but as powerful portals into memory. Stacy's an author, artist, and photographer. Her photography has been featured extensively in books and magazines, including, and I can't read them all here, but At Home, Garden Design, Luxe Interiors, Horticulture, Living, British Homes and Gardens, The Wall Street Journal, and as I said, many more. Welcome to the show, Stacy. Nice to have you on today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I have to tell you, and as we said right before we started the show, the book has not come out yet, right? The date is what, September 16th?
Correct. September 16th is publication day.
Okay, well, I was able to get a copy of the book, and I have read half of it, and it is, I have to say, your writing is terrific. It's great, and it's
Thank you.
moving. Yeah, it really is. And I identified with a lot of the issues, characters in the book, etc. But we'll talk about that later. But anyway, but my first question is, yes, you're a photographer. When did you first realize how life-changing a photograph can be? Like when you're dealing with loss and trying to be resilient.
Yeah,
That's
I
kind
don't
of
know
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I don't, that's okay. I don't know that I ever really thought about it until this accident. In the aftermath of the accident, which I think would be the case for anybody suffering a loss, you're sort of grappling and grasping for anything you can find or do that will help you get through it. And I think that what I discovered was the thing that was making me most calm or most connected to my father in the aftermath was looking through photos. And I think, one of the things that I've learned in this process is that everybody has a drawer full or a closet full or a box, in the basement of family photos that some people don't pay a lot of attention to. But I feel like encouraging people to take those images out, to examine them with family and friends. At this point, there are fewer people that I can ask questions about who is this person and what happened in this photo. And having that extra information of what's going on outside the frame has been incredibly soothing to me in these 30 years since the accident.
Well, you say it's been 30 years, so it was a very different time. As you say, the photographs in the basement or
Hmm.
but I have 20,000 photos. I'm probably, or maybe even more on my cell phone.
Of
It's
course,
very,
that's changed everything. I mean,
that
everybody is a photographer. Everybody has thousands of images at the ready that they can access. And that's actually, interestingly, when my father passed away in 1995, the internet was still very new. I don't even remember exactly what year Facebook started, but I know that when I started to, be aware of what it was like to Google people and Google things, and I would Google my father and nothing would come back. And it started to make me feel like he had no digital footprint in this new world. And that if anybody was going to know anything about him beyond how he died, which was covered extensively in the news, it was going to be up to me to tell them, to teach them, to share, details about who he was and what his life was. And so I think that I sort of quietly took that upon myself as something that I wanted to do in the world for him. And then slowly, as Facebook kind of became a little bit more commonplace, I found myself on anniversaries, for example, his birthday or the anniversary of the accident or on Father's Day, just posting a picture of him from my archives, which then were not digital, and a couple of words or a paragraph about who he was or something about that picture that, struck me particularly that day. And I noticed just sort of in my own space, that it was helping me to share those things about him. And the reaction from other people was sort of similar. Like, I think people felt, wow, this is something I want to do for my loved ones. This is something I can do to stay connected to people who are gone. And I guess,
I'm going to stop you there because
yeah, go
it's
ahead.
really, yeah, I mean, you had an intense, extremely close relationship with your father. When you're talking about love, it was love. And what, you were 28 when the accident happened. But what about for people who don't have that kind of relationship? Maybe is it, and maybe there's a lot of rocky stuff, or things weren't going so well at the time of, let's say, an accident, or at the time of their loved one's death. Then what are the photographs? Could they be too painful? I mean,
I
sometimes
mean,
yeah.
of course, of
Yeah.
course. I mean, I would never say that my situation applies to everybody, but I think that there's a lesson there. And I think sometimes, even in situation where there is, as you said, unresolved things, sometimes those pictures can lead to resolution. Sometimes they can lead to kind of opening up, or a path where perhaps you discover someone in the family that you didn't know before, or a connection that you didn't know about. Hard to speak specifically to someone else's situation, but I found that the reaction that people have shared with me, having read some of what I've shared about each of my parents, was that it helped them to think about the relationships, their own relationships, in a different way, and maybe handle them slightly differently if possible. I know that because of how my father died, and because of the immediacy and the shock of that situation, when my mother was ultimately diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which, everybody knows is not something that many people survive. I was determined to learn some lessons, to take the lessons I learned from that different kind of loss, almost 25 years earlier, and apply it to that situation. And what that meant was being more present about what was happening, making sure that I tried to, collect stories that my mom was able to still tell, voice recordings that I have on my phone so that I can listen to her whenever I want to, which is something I never had with my father. At some point, in the grieving process, which, doesn't really end, I became sort of fixated on trying to find some kind of recorded evidence of his voice, because I felt like I was starting to lose it in my brain, and I couldn't recall it as quickly as I had. And so I called friends and family, does anybody have any kind of recording from a party, something? And nobody did. And I think that that felt like a real loss to me in that moment, and I was determined to not let that happen again. So I feel like, these are just little things that I think we all of us have to deal with grief in some form during our lives. And I think if any of the lessons that I have learned can be helpful to other people, it's worth sharing them.
Yeah, it almost sounds like in your, like with your father, with your dad, it's like it's a form of therapy, as you're describing it. And every time you look at a picture, and I don't know if you mentioned this in the book or not, but depending on where you one is at in their own life, the photograph takes on new meaning, even though it's this quote, it may be the same photograph, but you see it differently because you've experienced, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I think, the lens of grief is very different. My life pre-accident is completely transformed post-accident. And I think part of the rebuilding, of sort of getting your confidence again, and being able to exist in the world without this thing that was always your anchor in some ways, at least in my case, is a long process. And you're right, it was a therapy. It was sort of, very quiet internal therapy, journaling occasionally, writing something on the anniversary just to kind of calm my nerves, if you will. And then ultimately, it started to take form as something that could be helpful more broadly to people, to anybody who is suffering a loss.
Yeah.
And that was how it eventually morphed into what is now Lightkeeper.
And your own children, it keeps the memories, even if they weren't there, of your father alive. I don't know if that's the way, once you put it,
Yes,
but
I
yeah.
think I think that's right. I think, the concept of light keeping for me, the art and the act of light keeping, is literally about keeping the light alive of someone who has passed. And for my kids who never knew him, this is something that this book in some ways is something that they can always turn to as, the legacy of who he was. And my mother, they knew my mother, so that's a little bit of a different situation, but it absolutely is something that paints a picture that they wouldn't otherwise have. And one day when I'm not here, knowing that that is something I can leave behind feels really meaningful.
Uh, what would be the difference? Or, I mean, obviously there is a difference between, okay, that in terms of years when your dad died and you were in a different place when your mother died. But when someone dies unexpectedly, like your father, tragically, and then your mother has had pancreatic cancer and lived, I guess, for a year. So you were
Exactly.
prepared for her death. But I know when my own father died of congestive heart failure and in such uh, pain and not living the way he uh, could or used to,
Right.
I guess. Uh, I was almost a relief when he died because I didn't want to see him being living the way he, in pain. And I don't know if that's what I thought about when because
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally speaking, when somebody dies from a longer illness and there is pain involved, there is that element of relief for them. In my case, it was very short. You know, a year is not a long time. And I think I was so focused on wanting to honor my mother while I could, while she was aware of it. And that was, as you mentioned at the beginning, I started this living tribute, which was sort of evolved into almost like a love letter to her. And in the process of writing these daily posts that they shared on Facebook with a photo from her life, non-chronologically, just something that occurred to me in the morning. I'd look for a photo, I'd put it on with a sentence or two about something that it made me think of or something about her. And the groundswell of response, the people who would reach out to my mom through these posts and ask her questions about the picture or relate to it in some way. Like I went to a summer camp near there as well, or I remember that coffee shop on the corner too. Whatever it was something that really engaged her and in many ways distracted her from the battle that she was fighting, like allowed her to feel alive and human and engaging with people in a way that she wouldn't if she was just going back and forth to the hospital for treatments all the time. And I think the process of writing that was cathartic for her in many ways, and definitely for me. It was a chance for me to express to her everything that was unsaid, although in this case there weren't a lot of things unsaid. But in the process, I learned a lot of things that I felt that I almost didn't realize that I felt. And I think as a result, when she eventually passed, I felt, oh, it was horrible in every way that, of course, it was horrible, but it also, I didn't feel that I had left anything out. I felt like she felt the love. She saw how intentionally I tried to connect and honor her during that illness. And it made me feel like it was the best possible way that she could leave the world if she had to leave at all.
so there was nothing. You didn't feel there were no unsaid things. Nothing you said. Oh, I wished I had done this or said this. You had,
Nothing,
yeah, which is really
nothing.
comforting, I think. And
Yeah, in many ways it is. And, you know, obviously the contrast between the situation with any kind of accident is extreme. And, you know, you don't have the chance to say literally anything. And all of a sudden your world, you know, has a hole in it that you never saw coming. Such a different situation. And I'm certainly not saying that one is better or worse. They're both horrible. But I think the lessons of one can inform the other.
I'm assuming that it made a difference. Also, you were much younger when your father died than you were.
Right.
Uh,
I was 28, and when
yeah,
my mother died, I was, you know, in my 50s. Very
yeah,
different situation. I had a family. You know, it was, of course, at a very different, more mature place in my life. I think that, you know, when you have the kind of tragic accident happen in your life, there's a little part of your brain that thinks, oh, that's my share. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
nothing else bad can happen because this is like the ultimate bad. And I think in some ways, my mother's diagnosis was sort of blindsiding. I just didn't expect something that extreme to happen in my life again, but I was better prepared for it, no doubt.
yeah. More mature. better prepared. And also, it would seem to me, I mean, in some ways, you would have the opportunity, or you had the opportunity to know your mother better because your relationship evolves over the years, and you had,
Absolutely.
yeah, and that makes a difference.
For sure. I mean, I would say that as you mentioned, as close as my father and I were, like I definitely felt that I knew him extremely well. But again, from the vantage point of a 28-year-old, which is not the same thing at all, as you know.
You talked about, you were just telling us, because I had about connections, like you were able to connect by doing what you did in photographs and sort of introducing your mother to the world as she was sick and as she was dying. You created all these connections for her. Did you talk to her about that a lot, or did you have
Of
discussion?
course.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
of course. I mean, what happened was when she was diagnosed, the first month, as often would be the case, is just an absolute swirl of activity and trying to get your arms around what's happening and what can be done about it. So we spent, 30 days going to every imaginable doctor, finding out what course of action was appropriate. And I think once we kind of had that, at least a plan of action, I was exhausted from those 30 days and quite distraught. And but again, not wanting to show that to my mother. I wanted to show that I had some confidence and that I felt she could get to the other side of it, which very part of me really did believe. And so I asked her after, yet another sleepless night, what do you think about this idea of sharing about this on social media as a way of creating a community of support around you? And she hesitated and she said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, and I explained a little bit, and I said, "Obviously, you would have to be completely on board because I would be telling the world that you have this disease that you are likely going to die from." And she thought about it and got back to me and said, I think you should do it. How long will you do it for?" And I said, let's go for a year. Let's let that be our goal. So it became the kind of thing that if my mom woke up in the morning and the post wasn't there, she would call and say, "Where's my post?" She looked forward to it in a way that really made me happy and made me feel like it was buoying her in a way that I didn't expect necessarily that it would. And I loved that she looked forward to it. She looked forward to the conversation that would ensue with whoever would comment or ask a question. And interestingly, at her memorial, which was almost exactly a year later, there were many people there who never knew her. They only knew her through the tribute. And I just felt that really spoke to how powerful it can be. I mean, social media, as we all know, can be bad in lots and lots of ways, and that's certainly been proven. But what it's good at is making connections, in particular, creating a community around a common goal. And I think in this case, it really succeeded in doing that, and mightily so.
Well, her death was all about her, not all about you. And I think that sometimes when our loved ones die, we become consumed with, our own grief. But what you did for her, it was a celebration of her life. And it was all about her. I think that's extraordinary, actually.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
And as you said, and I do want to touch on this too, because constantly telling us we are oversaturated with, visual media, too much on social media.
Hmm.
Criticizing kids or younger people for recording too much of their personal lives. How does that fit into this picture? Literally picture.
Well, I mean, I have strong feelings about how social media has affected lots of kids that I know very well, including my own. And I think this feels like an exception in the sense that it had a very specific purpose, and it wasn't about likes or how many comments. I wasn't, a lot of that is, I think, the aspect of social media that I think is dangerous, that the kids are get wrapped up in who's looking at this? Like, is everybody liking what I'm doing? Like that kind of feeling is the thing that I think is really challenging, certainly developmentally when kids are younger. In this case, that wasn't at all the goal or important. It was even just important that she could wake up and see that connection. And by the way, correct me if I made an error. If I said something was 1966 and it was 1965,
Yeah.
she would let me know.
Yeah.
And I feel like in that way, it felt like kind of like almost like a protected area, if you will, of social media that served a very precise purpose and did it well.
Yeah. So it's not like social media, like with kids, like looking for approval.
Right,
And yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So that's very different. Um, what can now your profession, you are a photographer, so we're not all photographers. How does this, what can we do, let's say,
Well,
in
I mean,
many,
honestly,
yeah.
the photographs there are 60 photographs in the book, and each vignette, as you saw, begins with a photograph. And most of those photographs were taken either by someone I don't know, certainly by people who were not professionals. Many were taken by my father. A few were taken by me. I think maybe 8 or 9. I should go actually look. But it's not important that they be even well composed photographs sometimes. It's sometimes just the image itself that creates the question, what's outside the frame? What's happening here? And using those images as a portal into grief works with any photograph.
What about the idea, and I think this is becoming a popular kind of a trend actually, of videoing
Yeah.
your,
Living, there
yeah,
are all kinds of trends, as you said, a living stories, a legacy, different
yeah.
different companies that are creating an opportunity where you can tell your story and actually they'll make it into a book for you. I saw that online recently. So for sure, those things, I mean, when I was recording my mom, I was intentionally not videoing her because she was in a hospital bed and did not want to be videoed. But having the audio tapes where I'm actually, just on my phone, recording on my phone, asking her questions about her life or reminding her, remember the story about Bobby Darin? Could you share that with me now? And to have that story in her own words is something I think everybody would benefit from, at least the reminder that you can do that and to do it before you can't any longer.
Uh, so what I also want to get some of the or tell us about the reaction, your children's reaction to what you were doing and to this whole process with their grandmother.
I think that my kids followed along very closely and certainly commented on certain days about a particular picture that struck them in such a way. They were very close to my mom, so it felt like something they were part of. What's interesting is my son, who is just about to be 27, read the book, of course, and he commented to me the other day that even though a lot of these stories he knew, at least in part, that seeing them all together in one place and reading them all together in one place is the first time he felt my father in particular kind of come alive as a three-dimensional person. Obviously, he knew my mother, so very different, but that to me was, maybe not the stated goal, but I guess the unspoken goal of exactly what I was trying to accomplish, and to know that my kids and my grandkids can go back and have this record of who this man was that, was their legacy, and in my son's case, his namesake as well.
Yeah. So you put it all together. I think that's I mean, I think that's really that's a very important point, because I know I mentioned like in the beginning of the interview, I have 20,000 pictures or photographs on
Hmm.
myself. Well, they're random photographs. Put it together, as you say, put it together, make a picture, um, and which is what your son was talking about. We only have a couple minutes left. So,
Sure.
yeah, it was the title of the book is Lightkeeper, a memoir through the lens of love and loss. And I've been talking to Stacy Waldman Bass. Stacy, so all right, give us websites or platforms to go to so that,
Sure,
yeah,
sure. Listeners can see more or learn more at lightkeepermemoir.com, which will give you a little bit more context about the book, as well as see some of the blurbs and things that have been written about it, as well as links to where to purchase. It's available for pre-order now, anywhere you buy books, literally anywhere and everywhere. Will also be released on audiobook, which I recorded myself this summer. And if you're interested in seeing more of my photography, you can look to stacybassphotography.com.
fantastic. Thanks so much for being on the show today and sharing all of this. And obviously, there's lots more to in the book. And I have half the book to read, so I'm excited about that. Yeah, it's
Oh,
very, as
thank
I
you
said,
so much
yeah.
for having me.
Thank you, Stacy. Joining me today is Juliet Fay, author of The Harvey Girls. Charlotte Crowninshield was born into one of the finest Boston society families. Now she's on the run from a brutal husband, desperate to disappear into the wilds of the Southwest. Billy McTavish is the oldest of 9 children born to Scottish immigrants in Nebraska. She quit school in the 6th grade to help with her mother's washing and mending business, but even that isn't enough to keep the family afloat. Desperate, both women joined the ranks of the Harvey Girls, waitresses who serve in America's first hospitality chain on the Santa Fe Railroad. Hired on the same day, they share 3 things: a room, a heartfelt dislike of each other, and each has a secret that will certainly get them fired. When they're sent to work at the luxurious El Tovar Hotel at the Grand Canyon, the challenges only grow. As Billy struggles to hide her young age from would-be suitors, and Charlotte discovers the little-known dark side of the national park's history. Juliet Fay is a graduate of Boston College and Harvard University. Welcome to the show, Juliet.
Thank you so much, Kathryn.
It's great to have you on the show today. Okay. So I guess the first question is going to be, I read this little vignette about the story, but who were the Harvey girls and why do they matter? Let's get into that.
All right. So to understand the Harvey girls, you have to understand Fred Harvey. He was born in England in 1835, came over to America as a teenager by himself, a few dollars in his pocket, and got a job as a pot walloper in a fancy New York restaurant. That is a dishwasher for you and me.
Okay.
And that's how he developed his love of fine dining. So he, really wanted to open his own restaurant, but things didn't work out. He ends up working for the railroad. And as a freight agent, he had to travel a lot in the railroad, which he hated because the food was legitimately disgusting. So in the 1800s, steam engines stopped every 100 miles or so to refuel with coal or water, and little rustic farms, food stands cropped up at these stops to feed hungry passengers. The food was at best simple. At worst, it resulted in death by food poisoning. So Fred Harvey thought, if I could put restaurants at these stops, nice restaurants, the passengers would certainly be happier, but also the railroad would really stand to gain. So he worked out a deal with the Santa Fe Railway, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, and set up his first restaurant in Topeka, Kansas. It was very popular. Many more Harvey houses, as he called them, soon came along. But he had one big problem, and that was that his waiters tended to get drunk and into fights. The West was still pretty wild in those days, but it was very much considered that if you had a fine restaurant, you had waiters. Waitresses were considered about one step up from a saloon girl. So it was a little bit of a sketchy profession. So, but his managers were begging him to do something about this, and he said, "Okay, we can try hiring women, but we can't call them waitresses. We'll have to call them Harvey girls." And
let me just say, the people who were eating at the restaurants, I'm assuming, were mostly, if not all, men.
No, not necessarily. No. They were railroad passengers. So if you were going from anywhere in the Midwest or the East to, say, Texas or California, you were going to ride on the Santa Fe Railroad. And before 1857, you were going to get a terrible meal, multiple of them.
Okay. So I mean, because you're talking about the girls or the title of waitress, they were considered one step above not a prostitute,
a saloon girl,
girl, right?
Not necessarily a prostitute, but sort of sketchy.
Yeah. Okay.
And so in order to make sure that these girls were considered proper, he dressed them sort of like nuns with long black dresses to their ankles and their wrists, big white pinafore over them. They lived in dorms above the restaurants and had very strict rules for comportment. They had to be, strictly comport themselves with utmost propriety at all times or be immediately fired. They weren't allowed to date any other Harvey employees, and they could only date outside the Harvey, family, if they got their manager's approval. So they were very much they had all these very strict rules that they had to comply with. The interesting thing is that he also gave them a lot of freedom, and that was in a couple of ways. One was he gave them vacation time. So every 6 months, you could have a week off and you could travel anywhere on the Santa Fe. This is throughout the Southwest. You could stay at Harvey dorms for free and eat for free. And at that time, women traveling alone was considered inappropriate. But Harvey girls traveling together was fine. So these girls often had adventures that they would never have had at home. Most of them came from the Midwest and the East. A lot of farm girls who didn't have much hope of getting off the farm, often not terribly educated. And this was a way for them to have a little bit of an adventure, but also to earn good money. He paid them well. He paid them better than most professions that women could get into at that time. And for a lot of these girls, this was the first time they had their own money. Many of them were sending money home, and it made them important breadwinners in the family. But also, they had sort of agency over their own lives. They had money that they could spend as they saw fit. One of the interesting things I learned about Harvey girls is they tended to marry later than girls in their aged group because they didn't need a man to support them. And they had their own money, they could support themselves. They really came to like their freedom. And also in the Southwest, there were many more men than women. There was in the 1800s when Fred Harvey started, it was 2-to-1 men to women, prospectors, ranchers, railroad men. So this influx suddenly of young women into the Southwest meant that they had really good odds. They didn't have to jump at the first guy who came along. They could hold out and wait for somebody they thought really suited them.
But it must have been a really tough environment for them, as you're saying. I mean, the Wild West or whatever, the West, the Midwest, but the Wild West was pretty, as you say, there were a lot of men, and difficult for women. And why didn't, or most of us, I'll say, don't know about the Harvey girls? This is a part of women's history that I don't really read or see about, today.
That's so true, Kathryn. I will say one thing. It was the Wild West, but these restaurants were very high end. White tablecloths, silverware, really good food, because Fred Harvey had a sweetheart deal with the railroads that he could bring anything he wanted in, and the transport was free. So he was serving oysters in Arizona. So these were nice restaurants.
Wait, I'm going to stop you there. Oysters in Arizona in the 1800s. What about refrigeration? How did they do that? I thought refrigeration.
Yeah, they had ice cars that they could, and they had ice, they could keep things on ice. They might not have started the oysters as early as the 1800s, but certainly by the early 1900s. So you got a wide range of food. People were expected to be proper in these restaurants, and mostly they were. So it wasn't, this rough and ready kind of environment for these girls. They were very protected in some ways. And as to why no one's heard of the Harvey girls, honestly, I learned about them because I was writing my previous historical fiction, which is about 3 friends who jump on a train to head to Hollywood and try and make it in the silent movie industry in the 1920s. And I thought, well, it's a long train ride. Like, how are they going to eat? And that's how I heard about the Harvey girls. And as soon as I learned about them, I said, that's my next book, because I was fascinated. And it's also interesting because there were 100,000 women who became Harvey girls from 1876 till the 1960s, when the company was sold. 100,000 women. In the Southwest, it's much more likely that people have heard of them, especially if they're a little bit on the older side. But when I talk to people in the East, nobody's ever heard of them. And it was a very cool thing for these women.
Yeah, it was
So
interesting, and the women in the book are very different. Obviously, come from very different backgrounds, as I read in the intro. Right? I mean,
right,
totally. Yeah,
right.
180. They have their secret. I don't think we want to tell their secrets, do we?
Well,
Or do
I think
you?
you already know their secrets. One of them is that Charlotte is married. Now, women were not supposed to be married when they started. They certainly weren't supposed to get married until they had at least a year of service under their belts. So the fact that she was married and she lied on her application, she could have easily been fired. So she's keeping that to herself. Billy is 15. You needed to be 18 to be a Harvey girl. But I learned about a lot of young women who were sort of, desperate to make this kind of money and help their families, and they would lie about their age because it was a good gig. So Billy is trying to keep the fact that she's really only 15 from anyone knowing, and Charlotte's trying to keep her marriage a secret.
And what about your interest? Because you mentioned your other book, okay, the 1920s has some,
Mhm.
obviously, there's an interest, I don't want to say fascination, I don't know, but what about the 1920s is that you like to write about?
Well, that's such a great question. It was a fascinating time. I will say my first historical novel is called The Tumbling Turner Sisters. And I started doing the research for that because my great grandfather was in vaudeville. And this is a story about vaudeville. It's about four sisters who become create a tumbling act and travel from town to town on the vaudeville circuit. So that's where my interest in the 1920s started. And then from learning about vaudeville, I ended up learning about the silent movie era. So I sort of moved on to that. And then from the silent movies, I learned about the Harvey Girls. So it's just been one thing that's led to another. And I do love the 20s. They're pretty fascinating.
So we're talking about women coming of age in the 1920s, and that we've sort of forgotten all about that time in our history, right? So and I'm thinking about where we are today. Can we make a comparison? Or have we gone, you're talking about all the freedoms they had, the independence, the ability to travel, all of those kinds of things. How have we, how far have we come?
That's such an interesting question. I think we've come a long way, to be perfectly honest. There are many more opportunities available for women. There's many more, chances to see the world, many more opportunities to be self-sufficient. And so I think we've come a long way. Are we done? Are we completely there? I would say no. But it is really interesting to learn about these times and realize how far we have come.
Okay. What about the training for these girls? I'm assuming they had to go through some training, and what were the expectations for what they were able to do?
Sure. So Fred Harvey was such a stickler. He wanted girls who had no training because he wanted them to be trained in the Harvey standard. That's what he called it. So he didn't want to hire women who had already, been waitresses. He was starting with a blank slate. Most of the girls started in Topeka, Kansas, his first restaurant, and they would work for free for a month. They could get tips and they had free room and board, but they didn't get paid, and they were learning the ropes. So they would they would work 6 days a week, sometimes 10, 12 hours a day. It was hard work, but it was, like I said, they made pretty good money. And when they did have time off, they were able to go places and see things. After that month, they would then be sent out on the line, as it was called, out on the railroad. And depending on how good they were, if they were really good, they might be sent to someplace sort of fancy, like El Tovar at the Grand Canyon. And if they weren't, if they were a little iffy, they'd get sent to some, quieter, more back roads place.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the fact, like, if once these girls stopped being, or they no longer working as Harvey girls, and they had all this independence and they made money and all the things that you've been talking about in the 20s, how did they get back into, what happened to them after that? They married, you said they married later. Did they marry later, have children, and get back to the 1920s mentality of how women were treated or what the expectations were for their behavior? Because very different than what these girls were experiencing.
That's right. And I have to believe that many of these women, and they talk about, if you read interviews with former Harvey girls, they liken it to college. Like they went away, they lived in dorms, they learned a trade, not they didn't get a degree, but they learned a lot about how to do things right. And it changed them. And it gave them higher standards, not only for restaurant service, but also for sort of what they wanted in their lives. About half of all Harvey girls, well, I will say this, they often stayed for a long time. There were Harvey girls that stayed there their whole careers. They would get married sometimes, but people loved working for Fred Harvey. About half of all Harvey girls, that 100,000, young women who became Harvey girls, stayed in the Southwest. Many of them did marry. And many of them had children whom boys they named either Fred or Harvey because they were proud of their service. And Fred Harvey is actually credited with populating the Southwest because Harvey girls made it possible for men to find wives and for them to have children.
So what happened to Fred Harvey? And was there any, when he was, I guess, establishing this business with these women, what was his, I mean, was there a pushback to that?
There doesn't seem to be any pushback. I think because they were clearly not, sort of just slinging hash in a diner somewhere. He died in 1901. His two of his sons took over the business, Ford and Byron, but they never changed the name of the company. It was always Fred Harvey. And people up until the company was sold in the 1960s said, "I work for Fred Harvey," as if he was still alive.
Well, who did they sell the company to in the 60s?
They sold the company to, things were changing. Certainly, even in the 1920s and 30s, trains were getting faster, so people weren't stopping as often. They were getting faster, and they didn't need to stop every 100 miles for coal and water. So some of those little towns that cropped up around the Harvey House then sort of became ghost towns. Also, people were starting to travel by plane. So they weren't, again, stopping at, along the railroad and cars. Certainly in the 50s, cars became the way that people traveled. They might stop at a Harvey House, but they didn't have to. They had other options. So the business was changing. Fred Harvey still owned the concessions at, sort of bigger places like the Grand Canyon. And though that concession was sold to a company that became Xanterra, which now has the concessions for all the national parks. So, there's still, elements of Fred Harvey out in the world.
So Juliet, are these the beginning of franchises or
He did not franchise them.
he
He
did
owned
not?
all of
Oh,
them.
he owned every,
No,
yeah. And in the process, accumulating a fortune, or not?
he did quite well for himself.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was very important to him that he had a high quality of service. So I'm not sure how much the margins were on this, because he could only charge so much, but he did quite well for himself. Yes. And it was the first hospitality empire in the world ever. Long before Howard Johnson's, long before Hilton, the Fred Harvey Company was the first chain that we had.
And that's what, and getting back to that, okay, if that was why don't I still questioning, I guess, like if that was the first chain, why don't we, we hear about Howard Johnson's, obviously, we hear about the other chains, but we never hear about the Harvey chain or the Harvey girls.
I think, as I said, people in this, because it was limited to the Southwest, people in the Southwest knew about it, but it wasn't, I mean, certainly in its day, the whole country knew about it because it was considered such a sort of high-end, very luxurious thing to do to travel by train through the Southwest and stay at Fred Harvey hotels and eat at his restaurants. But it has, it's sort of tumbled into the dustbin of history. And one of the things that I hope this book will do is really let people know more about it.
I think that's great. I think Americans in particular know very little about history, even our history.
Yeah,
So, right? And so, yeah,
I have to agree with you there. Yeah.
yeah. Uh, I don't know if I read this in the interview, but Charlotte, one of the women in the book, discovers a little known dark side of the national park's history.
Yes.
Yeah, what do we know what that is?
Sure. And this was also fascinating to me because I didn't, as often as I've been to the Grand Canyon, I didn't know this either. In 1893, when the Grand Canyon South Rim became a forest reserve, and then in 1919, when it became a national park, there was between those times there was this there were 8 Indian tribes that lived in and around the Grand Canyon. The Havasupai lived predominantly around the South Rim, Grand Canyon Village, which is what we know now. And the federal government decided that they did not want Native Americans there. They wanted to sort of, shoo them out of there so that the Grand Canyon could be quote unquote saved for white tourists, European Americans. And so the Havasupai, for instance, they traveled all over an area that was twice the size of Rhode Island, hunting and farming and certainly enjoying the scenery there. And they were corralled onto a reservation of 1 square mile in area so that they were out of sight. And Native Americans are still there. They were there the whole time. And Charlotte gets to know a couple of Native Americans and starts understanding more and more about sort of how they were deprived and really decimated as tribes. It made it very hard for them to feed their families. And certainly Charlotte, who's been raised in a life of privilege with servants of her own, is very startled to find this out. And it gives her a real new perspective.
Well, this is a fascinating piece of history. Very interesting. We only have a couple minutes left, and we want, obviously, listeners to go out and get the book, read the book, or listen to the book. I don't know if you're on Audible or not, but
I am, yes.
Good. Julie Fay is the author, and the title of the book is The Harvey Girls. So, Juliet, give us a website and other platforms to go to for more information about the book. And
sure. My website is julietfay.com, and the book, ebook, print, and audio is available pretty much anywhere books are sold. And I will just say one last thing. I spent a lot of time with book clubs. And so if a book club chooses one of my books and they reach out to me, I will Zoom with book clubs when they meet to discuss the book. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun for me, and it's fun for them to ask questions or make comments. So I would invite people to reach out to me on my website if your book club chooses one of my books.
Oh, great. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, thanks for being on the show today. Great having you. Fascinating topic. Yeah. Anyway, the Harvey
Kathryn,
Girls.
thank you so much. I appreciate it.